Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I can see people are still coming in, so I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes until the attendee numbers stop going up. It's lovely to see so many people here. Okay, it looks as though that's everybody. Oh, it's still going up a little bit. I'm gonna let it get to 80 people. This is a great turnout. It's lovely to see so many people interested in the report. And then I will get us started. Okay, so once again, welcome to our webinar. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We have two BSL interpreters joining us today. So if you need to see them, see Leah at the moment, please pin their windows on Zoom. If you've got any questions about that, can you contact us in the Q&A button at the bottom, and we can support you with that. Also to say, we're going to be recording the session so that we can share it in the future. Only the speakers will be recorded, nobody else is on camera, so you won't be visible, but so that you're aware of that. Also, a really quick, potentially unnecessary apology for my internet connection this morning. It's been a little bit sporadic whilst we've been doing a tech run, but hopefully all will be good. So the session today is going to explore the findings of our domestic abuse report, the annual, the provision and uptake of domestic abuse support services in England, alongside the experiences of women who use them for the financial year 2021 to 22. The researchers who worked on the report are going to present their findings to you today in summary, and then we'll have time at the end to hear from you about experiences and change that you'd like to see, as well as a more general question and answer context, which is me now. And then we're going to hear from George Wood, who'll talk to us about the findings from On Track about the experiences of women using services. Emma Clark is going to talk to us about what routes to support data tell us about the provision available in England. Then Catherine Dean, Maya Samuel and Phoebe Nicholson-Pallett are going to talk more on the findings of Women's Aid's latest annual survey, which looks to challenges and successes in the sector over that same year. So the report that we've recently published, it comprises data and findings from a range of data sets. You can find out more about all of these on the Women's Aid website via our evidence hub. On Track and Routes to Support are the two administrative data sets that Women's Aid hold, looking at women using services and the experiences that they have, support needs they have, and Routes to Support looks at the availability of provision across the country and refuge vacancies. The annual survey, again, as the name would suggest, is our long-established annual survey of domestic abuse service providers, and that gives us the context around the data. Relate depending on happening in the particular year. So it goes out to all providers that are on Routes to Support, not just Women's Aid members. Since 2020, we've also used results of an FOI to local authorities to supplement them into the extent of non-commissioned services in the network. And we've been publishing these findings all together in our annual audit series of reports since 2017, so there's quite a few there now. And it gives us a picture every year of the sector, how well it's been able to meet needs and challenges during the year. Some of the data we collect then is shared through data dashboards on our evidence hub. For example, numbers of women and children accessing support, numbers of refuge spaces and services available by region. And then the annual audit, of course, includes a focus on the wider social and policy context for that year. So as well as data and stats that we update every year, we give a changing contextual picture, and we'll talk about that as well today. The Domestic Abuse Act in 2021 introduced a statutory duty on Tier 1 local authorities in England to provide support for survivors of domestic abuse, including children within safe accommodation, regardless of whether they have a local connection. So in the annual audit this year, obviously we focus a significant portion on how services were experiencing changes following the implementation of the statutory duty. So that's yes, point about acronyms. Definitely we'll be mindful of that, and the same to the speakers if we use any acronyms. I'm sorry, I can't remember which ones I've used already. If there was something in particular, pop it in the questions and I will go back. Freedom of information request. I think it was that one. So I am going to, we're going to hear from our speakers shortly. I will hand over to them in a second. And then after that, we're going to ask to hear from you. So we've got a couple of questions that we want to hear from you on. Do the findings of our audit reflect your own experiences and or the experiences of your organisation over the past year? And what change do you want to see to address these issues? So we're going to ask for your feedback, so that they're popped up on the screen now for you to ponder. And after that, of course, we'll have time for general Q&A. And for both of these, if you can use the Q&A tab, which you should see at the bottom of your screen underneath the slides. So I'm going to pass over to our researchers now for the first presentation, which I believe is George Wood.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is George, and I'm Senior Research and Evaluation Officer at Women's Aid, working as part of the On-Track team. And I'm going to be going through some of our key findings outlined in Section 1 of the annual audit. So Section 1 looks at the profile, needs and experiences of women accessing domestic abuse support services. To do this, we've used data from Women's Aid's bespoke case management and outcomes monitoring system, On-Track. On-Track is used by 91 local domestic abuse support services across England, who, through their daily work, contribute to an anonymised national data set, which holds data on the journeys of around 200,000 survivors. For the annual audit 2023, we've used a sample of 38,045 female survivors who finished a period of support from a refuge or community-based support service using On-Track between the 1st of April 2021 and the 31st of March 2022. Of these, 3,499 accessed refuge services and 34,546 accessed community-based support or CBS services. To quickly go over these service types, a refuge service offers accommodation and support for women experiencing domestic abuse. Residents also receive a programme of therapeutic and practical support from staff and access peer support from other residents. Within community-based support services, we include floating support, outreach and domestic abuse advocacy, including independent domestic violence advisors. A full explanation of these service types can be found in the glossary of the annual audit. Before we dive into these findings, it's important to note that On-Track only records the data of those women who have successfully accessed domestic abuse support services. We therefore have not captured those who, for a variety of reasons, are unable to access specialist help or are delayed in doing so. This sample should therefore not be seen as representing all survivors of domestic abuse, but should instead be understood within the context of those who were able to access support. So over 3/4 of survivors in our sample were aged 21 to 45, with the most common age group being those aged 31 to 35. It's worth noting that older women may be underrepresented in this sample due to the specific barriers they face in accessing support. The majority of women in our sample had children, for an average of 1.3 children per service user. For those service users who had children, the average number of children was 2. A further 6.1% of service users in the sample were pregnant. These figures highlight the importance of considering a woman's children in the support being provided. For example, this highlights the importance of providing refuge spaces which can accommodate a survivor with several children. Over a quarter of our sample reported having a disability. The majority of these, at 21.1% of the total sample, reported having a mental health condition. The second most common disability reported was a physical disability, at 8.1% of the total sample. This is especially important to highlight, as we'll look into further when we discuss section 2 of the report, but only a very limited number of refuge vacancies listed on routes to support were suitable for women with limited mobility or for women requiring wheelchair accessible accommodation. "41% of service users reported having a support need around their mental health. This was 10 percentage points higher for those in refuge. Similarly, over a third of service users reported feeling depressed and/or having suicidal thoughts, a proportion which was 12 percentage points higher for those accessing refuge support. There's a well-established link between domestic abuse and mental ill health, yet many survivors still face barriers accessing adequate mental health support. Women's Aid have established 7 pillars for a survivor-led approach to mental health support as part of our research for our Deserve to be Heard campaign. If you're interested in reading more about this, the full report is available through our online evidence hub. "4,628 service users in our sample were not British nationals. This is important to note, as factors such as insecure immigration status or lack of knowledge about their rights as non-British nationals can prevent or delay a survivor from accessing support. For example, spouse visas can be used as a basis for coercive control if a survivor's immigration is dependent upon their perpetrator, and survivors may delay seeking support for fear of deportation. Almost a third of service users who were not British nationals were recorded as having no recourse to public funds. This means they're unable to claim most state benefits and are therefore limited in the support they can access. Our research also shows that many survivors are misreported as having no recourse to public funds, preventing them from accessing support to which they're entitled. Finally, service users reported experiencing a range of abusive behaviours. The most common type of abuse experienced was emotional abuse at 85.5% of service users. A further 64.4% of service users reported experiencing jealous and/or controlling behaviours. The prevalence of these abuse types demonstrates how emotional abuse and coercive control often underpin other forms of abuse. Moreover, 94.6% of recorded perpetrators were male, and 73% of perpetrators were the partner or ex-partner of the service user, which illustrates the gendered nature of domestic abuse. These statistics have provided a brief overview of the profile of those accessing domestic abuse support services in England in 2021-22. The full report contains these findings in much more detail, along with additional findings in areas such as accessibility, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. This year, we've also presented additional findings on accommodation and employment. As we move on to discussing section 2, which outlines domestic abuse provision in the same period, it's worth keeping these figures in mind in order to understand how provision may not always meet the needs of survivors accessing support. Before I pass you over to my colleague Emma, if you're interested in implementing OnTrack for your organisation, please get in touch with us at ontrack@womensaid.org.uk. Taking up OnTrack not only gives you access to our bespoke case management system, but also allows you to contribute to important national research such as the annual audit. The OnTrack team also offer an extensive range of tailored workshops to support you in data collection, analysis, and evaluation. Now I'll pass you on to my colleague Emma, who will be discussing the findings from section 2 of the report.
Thank you, George. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm going to be talking through section 2 of the annual audit, which looks at the available service provision across England using data from Routes to Support. Routes to Support is the UK Violence Against Women and Girls Directory of Services and Refuge Vacancies, which we run in partnership with other women's aid federations in the UK. It's used by professionals to identify suitable domestic abuse services for the women, children and men they're supporting, and is used by all domestic abuse services, not just women aid services. As a data set, it provides us with a comprehensive picture of the scope and nature of domestic abuse service provision over time. And for this annual audit, we look at data on the available service provision in England on the 1st of May 2022 and analyse refuge vacancies posted to Routes to Support during the financial year 2021 to 2022. Today's presentation will look at 4 key findings from this analysis. As with snapshot data, these numbers can't give us the full picture of all the changes in service provision that happened throughout the year, but it provides a thorough insight into the number and accessibility of local domestic abuse services in England. In May 2022, there were 226 domestic abuse service providers listed on Routes to Support, which ran 395 local services between them across England, including 270 refuge services. These service providers continue to run a range of service types, and these are the different categories of support programmes which service providers run, such as refuge services, therapeutic support and prevention work. We saw a net increase in all service types since last year, except drop-in services, which stayed the same. Although this overall increase is positive, there were regional variations across England, and some regions saw a net decrease in service types, such as in the West Midlands and North West. This regional variation has been labelled a postcode lottery of support in a report by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and leaves many women without access to the support service types they need. The second key finding is that the number of bed spaces in England have increased since 2021, bringing the total to 4,344. A bed space refers to one unit of accommodation for a woman accessing refuge, irrespective of how many children she has. In the report, we go into depth about the services for men, but this presentation focuses on the availability of bed spaces for women. Due to emergency funding made available during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of bed spaces increased throughout the previous year, and it's positive to see this has been sustained throughout 2021 to 2022. Despite this, and again, the rate of change of numbers of bed spaces available varied across the country, with some seeing a decrease in numbers of available spaces, such as in the North East, which saw a decrease of 38 bed spaces. The total also still fell short of the Council of Europe's recommendation of 1 bed per 10,000 head of population. And despite the increase in the number of bed spaces, we actually saw the number of vacancies posted to Routes to Support fall in 2021 to 2022. Each vacancy is when the bed space becomes available and the service has a capacity to take on a new service user, so post the space to Routes to Support. There were 229 fewer vacancies posted to Routes to Support overall compared to 2020 to 2021, when vacancies were already at significantly lower levels due to the impact of the pandemic. This indicates that refuge services continue to face significant issues which affected their capacity, which we'll explore later in further sections of the presentation. We know there are significant barriers for some groups of women when finding a suitable refuge space due to the low numbers of bed spaces with the facilities to accommodate them. This is particularly notable for women who need wheelchair access, have no recourse to public funds, or who have 3 or more children. There are other factors at play here which may limit the availability of these spaces even more, such as services only having 1 bed space with these facilities, so can only accommodate 1 woman at a time with these support needs. There will also be regional variations in the number of suitable bed spaces available. Also, for women who have no recourse to public funds, they are often reliant on seeking funding from other agencies such as social services to secure their space, and this isn't always possible. All these factors will impact on the availability of suitable bed spaces for these women even more. We know from our on-track data that women who had these additional support needs make up a significant proportion of women accessing domestic abuse services, and these figures illustrate how difficult it can be to secure a refuge space and/or find the specialist support for them. For our final key finding, we estimated that if 100% of the services listed on routes to support were also using on-track, that over 10,000 women accessed all refuge services and over 130,000 women accessed community-based services since May 2021 to May 2022. These estimates show that current levels of service provision are unable to keep up with the demand for their support. A further example of this is that 29.9% of our estimated number of rejected referrals to refuges were as a result of services lacking in space or capacity. This will be discussed further in the following sections, so I'll hand over to Phoebe for section 3. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Phoebe and I am going to talk you through section 3 of the annual audit. And the findings from this section were taken from the annual survey, which we carry out every year in the summer. And this year we received responses from 84 organisations who were running 160 service entries en routes to support. To delve into some findings from the survey in a little more detail, this year we carried out in-depth interviews with 5 organisations who had also responded to the survey. This included organisations in different geographical locations, working locally and or nationally, and organisations of varying sizes. This year we included some specific questions around the impact of the statutory duty, along with our usual questions around resourcing and funding. I'm going to talk you through some of the main pressures on domestic abuse services during the 2021 to 2022 financial year. Okay, so as will come to no surprise to many of you, one of the things that we identified through the annual audit was the pressure that services were facing when it came to inadequate funding and resourcing. This is something that continues to be an issue throughout the domestic abuse sector year on year, with too many services struggling to meet demand, impacting their ability to best provide the high quality specialist and holistic services that they want to really empower survivors. Within the annual survey, we asked services to reflect on the challenges they had faced over the 2021 to 2022 financial year. As you can see, these pressures were mainly linked to capacity and resourcing. And as discussed, many of these concerns reflect findings from previous years. However, there were some ways in which these challenges were specific to the past financial year that relate to the wider societal and political context. This includes the COVID-19 pandemic, the Domestic Abuse Act and accompanying statutory duty, and the impending cost of living crisis that we are currently facing. It's also worth noting that many of these challenges also relate to the successes that many services reported. So, for example, when we asked services what they were most proud of during the 2021 to 2022 financial year, many spoke of their team's ability to adapt to constantly changing restrictions, continue delivering the service, and supporting survivors through a particularly turbulent period. When it came to case lengths and complexity of cases, many organisations reported having been able to support more women experiencing specific structural barriers and inequalities. So, for example, no recourse to public funds. I'm now going to talk you through how some of these issues were the main challenges organisations faced in 2021 to 2022. So, starting with capacity, it's easy to forget the extent to which 2021 was shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic, with services often having to adapt quickly to constantly changing restrictions and to run without full staffing capacity due to sickness. A few services also discussed how COVID-19 funding that they had been given in 2020 did not extend to 2021, yet the year was very much overshadowed by this. The issues with COVID-19 also impacted survivors a great deal, with many women struggling particularly with their mental health when it came to lockdown. It's also worth noting that the impact of not seeing loved ones and perhaps losing and grieving people during the pandemic also would extend to staff working in these services. Respondents reported as well that whilst the demand had fluctuated at different points throughout the year, with dips during periods of lockdown and sharp rises after, overall, a major challenge for the financial year was meeting demand. 87.7% of respondents in the survey reported that COVID-19 had affected demand for their services. And of these organisations, 84.5% told us that demand for support had increased. Along with increased demand, around 33.8% of organisations who reported that COVID-19 had affected demand for their services told us that the types of referrals they had received had changed during the pandemic. And from further free text box responses, many organisations reported supporting women with more complex support needs and/or structural barriers than previously. And I've just got a quote for you here. The biggest challenge is meeting the ever-increasing complexity of needs of the women using our services, alongside the limits on statutory funding for these services. A further issue was the lack of support or perhaps resourcing in external agencies that impacted the domestic abuse sector. For example, a few organisations reported that delays in accessing services such as the Department for Work and Pensions meant that the length of time they needed to spend working with a survivor actually increased. Similar to many workforces, recruitment and retention of staff was a problem across the domestic abuse sector during the 2021-22 financial year. A few organisations reported feeling that the introduction of the statutory duty was exacerbating this problem, with the domestic abuse sector losing valuable members of the service to statutory jobs with better working conditions. I'm now going to hand you over to Maya, who is going to talk you through some of the findings on funding and the statutory duty. Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe. My name is Maya. So capacity issues and staffing are, of course, linked to funding, and that's what I'll cover in this section. So we found that funding continues to be a major issue for domestic abuse services. Most services responding to the annual survey said that funding was the biggest challenge that they faced in 2021-22. So services talked about how the often short-term nature of contracts makes it difficult to plan long-term and causes disruption with staffing, and also how their funding levels have remained the same despite increased demand. 44% of organisations who responded to the survey reported that they were running an area of their work without dedicated funding, with the most common areas being domestic abuse prevention and education work, community-based support services, and therapeutic support like support groups and counselling. These services are vital for changing attitudes around domestic abuse and supporting survivors with long-term recovery. But in order to cover the costs of running services without dedicated funding, many organisations told us that they were using their reserves, which is not sustainable in the long term. And with all of these existing challenges, it's no surprise that the impact of the cost of living crisis had already become a concern for a number of organisations responding to the survey in the summer. So the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 aimed to address some of these funding challenges, as Sarah said in the introduction, by introducing a statutory duty on Tier 1 local authorities in England to provide support for survivors of domestic abuse within safe accommodation. We asked services for their feedback on how the duty was being implemented in their local area, and services reported a mixed picture of the impact of the duty. So in our interviews, some services spoke positively about having increased funding for refuge workers, and just under half annual survey respondents with a refuge service had received funding as a result of the duty. However, most respondents had not yet noticed any significant impacts of the statutory duty on their funding streams, Many still felt worried about where future funding for their refuge services would come from, and some expressed concerns that it may impact on their ability to access other funding streams. And those concerns are understandable because funding arrangements for domestic abuse services in England are often made up of a complex combination of grants, donations, commissioned funding from police crime commissioners and clinical commissioning groups, and most significantly, commissioned funding from local authorities. So to determine the level of local authority funding for refuge services, we use responses to our annual survey and to a freedom of information request that we sent to all local authorities in England. To fill in any gaps, we also contacted individual services to ask whether they were contracted for refuge by their local authority. And we found that 71.1% of refuge services were commissioned for all of the bed spaces in their refuge service. This was significantly lower for refuge services run by members of IMCAN, who provide vital services led by and for Black and minoritized survivors. So comparatively, only 45% of refuge services run by members of IMCAN were commissioned by the local authority for all of their bed spaces. Some refuge services were commissioned by the local authority, but provided additional spaces above the number they were contracted for. And there were 35 refuge services who received no local authority commissioned funding at all. Even for those refuge services who are commissioned, funding often does not cover all of the costs of providing the service. So commissioned funding does not usually cover things like building maintenance and core costs like admin and finance staff salaries, meaning that the shortfall has to be made up through additional fundraising or by drawing on reserves. I'm going to hand over to Catherine now to talk you through some more findings about services' experiences of the commissioning process.
Thanks, Maya. Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine. I'm Senior Research and Policy Officer here at Women's Aid. So this next section looks a little more closely at what we've found from the annual survey and the follow-up research interviews about how services were experiencing these commissioning processes over the past year and in the context of the statutory duty, as well as any trends that they'd been noticing. So firstly, respondents had, again, quite mixed experiences from their local authority processes around needs assessments, strategy development, and commissioning overall. Some reported that they'd been invited to participate in consultations with local authorities who involve partners and use their expertise and experiences from those existing domestic abuse services. However, some services told us, and this was elaborated on a little bit more in the follow-up interviews, that they had experienced what they perceived as quite a rushed approach from local authorities, and that's across needs assessments, strategy development, and commissioning more generally, with what they termed as a bit of a tick box attitude to the required processes rather than meaningful engagement. Needs assessments in particular were reported to have often been carried out quite poorly, and the services reported what they perceived as a bit of a lack of real commitment sometimes, and a lack of contextual understanding in those needs assessment processes, and sometimes leaning on services in more of an extractive rather than consultative way. So respondents to our annual survey and our interview participants also reflected on any emerging trends that they had observed in the commissioning process over the past year, and particularly since the statutory duty. So firstly, some respondents noticed that there had been an increase in local authority funding of in-house domestic abuse services and roles. They raised concerns regarding a potential loss of expertise from specialist domestic abuse services that could perhaps result from this. So to give you an idea of how this shift is kind of working in practice, prior to the introduction of the statutory duty in 2020, there was just one refuge service in England that was run by a local authority. However, in 2022, we found from Freedom of Information request data that at least 11 councils are now running some kind of in-house refuge or safe accommodation service. Unfortunately, these increases in in-house commissioning are actually already having an impact on specialist domestic abuse services, where multiple respondents told us that they had already lost staff from their specialist domestic abuse services for roles in the local authority. So secondly, services reported what they perceived as a shift towards perhaps more commercialised tendering processes. This included a bit of an increase in the emphasis on low administrative burdens, with services telling us that they were quite worried that local authorities were sometimes neglecting the importance of quality and specialism. Participants described concerns that domestic abuse commissioning was being viewed by some as a commercial opportunity, resulting sometimes in a move towards more universal housing services. Interviewees and survey respondents also noted concerns about the decommissioning of specialist services that would result from this, as well as specifically the decommissioning of holistic and wraparound services, so including particularly counselling and therapies. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Sarah, who is going to introduce the next section of the webinar. Thanks for listening.
Hello, thank you everybody. That was really comprehensive and a lot of information there in a short space of time. The next part of the webinar, we're hoping to hear more from people present. So we've got a couple of questions coming in already. We'd like to hear from you, first of all, in terms of how the findings that we've presented in this report reflect your own experiences. So of whether that's your own personal experiences, the experiences of the organisation that you work for over the past year, and you know, invite comments around that, and also to hear changes that you think would be important to address any issues that are raised there. So I'm going to, whilst you're sort of all having a think and hopefully typing in the Q&A, a couple of points in there already. I'm going to invite all of the speakers, please, to just pop your cameras back on. But I will leave those questions up on the slide for now, and we'll have a more general Q&A afterwards. Okay, so we had one comment from somebody, which is a really interesting point, and I think it was during the on track segment, but it relates to service provision and other things as well. Sort of talking about the lack of out of hours support, particularly in community-based services, and then the impact that can have on survivors. So I'll just read your comment out. I think that it's a big issue around access to services fueled by stereotypes around who experiences domestic abuse. As a survivor looking to access community services over the years, they're rarely offered outside office hours. So as someone working full-time, they're unavailable to me. And I think that is a really interesting, it's something we've certainly observed, and I'll open it up to the speakers, but hearing that impact in terms of being fueled by stereotypes and how that feels to survivors trying to access those services is really interesting. The participant goes on to note, I'm not sure whether this is a form relating to domestic abuse services or something else, but being asked for the highest education level and the options in the box ended at undergraduate degree. So you know, a number of assumptions in data collection tools, and I know that's something that we're very aware of, how data collection can be used negatively in that way. Does anybody want to respond to that one? Okay, perhaps about the impact of funding on resources. Sorry, Phoebe, you started to say something.
I think Maya was going to jump in.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in and say I think that very much relates to what myself and Phoebe discussed about sort of capacity and demand. You know, we know that services are trying to reach as many people as possible, but in the context of kind of limited funding, they're very much having to kind of target their services and often having to kind of strip things back. And so it might be that being able to provide out of hours support is just something that they're not able to do within the limited sort of funding and staffing levels that they have.
Definitely. Okay, I have more comments, but they're more questions rather than observations about experiences. Let me just have a just confirmed that it was a domestic abuse service. Okay.
So if I could just very quickly respond on the last observation, Sarah, I think that's a really good one, and especially around something that came up again in the survey was specifically services would really like to see more funding for community work. I think it's something that everyone's really aware of as an area that's possibly a little bit underfunded or particularly neglected at the moment, and that's something that yeah, definitely came through in the survey around specific funding being allocated for those kind of community-based support services.
Definitely, and it's something that, you know, we've called for on a more formal, statutory, more sustainable basis. And I think sustainability is a really key part of that as well, isn't it? It's about being able to have funding that goes on longer than the immediate short term, so that you can plan and you can resource for it, because of course all of this availability, when we talk about resources in the sector, we're talking about women in those roles working there, and you know, coming back to the points about recruitment, all of those challenges. And it's really easy to see that with the best of intentions, and I do really sort of take the point about negative stereotypes around survivors of domestic abuse, because that is definitely an issue as well. But even with the best of intentions, it's hard to resource support that is available for everybody. So I know when we talk about rises in the number of refuge spaces being available, we always caveat that really strongly with the accessibility of those spaces, because if the support doesn't exist around them, not all women can access them, and then you have that inequity of provision that we're talking about. So there's a couple of points here. Again, being told that somebody's, you know, saying that having been told that they're the wrong kind of survivor, and I think that talks again to those points about the importance of provision being available to everybody, and that we're all aware that domestic abuse can happen to everybody. Another one, having worked in refuges in the northeast, somebody says there is a gap between providing holistic support to women and children, while more prevalent issues such as sorting housing and benefit support are put into place, all of which can take hours waiting on calls. So I think there's something in those experiences about the impact of cuts potentially to other services. Was there anything that came out in the findings around that, or is that something that we would maybe want to explore more?
Catherine and Phoebe might be able to say a little more about what came up through the annual survey, but I know that that's something which we've certainly discovered in some of our subsequent research around the cost of living crisis and the impact on services. So there's some publications on our Evidence Hub relating to the cost of living, and that was very much a finding which came through about the impact on services there. Majority of services seeing the impact of restrictions, impacts of the cost of living crisis, and cuts on other services having that knock-on effect on the support that they're able to deliver to survivors due to things like delays and not being able to access those services.
Definitely, and again, yeah, participants have followed up with this creates additional stresses for women, places additional workload on staff, and links to burnout, and then coming right back around to the resourcing issue, which is definitely something that you've all talked about as coming through in the findings, and as Maya said, in our later research around the cost of living.
Yeah, I could add on to that with the research that I've been doing recently, that as others have said, that other research that we haven't touched on in the annual audit, other things that are coming up, that these working with survivors and speaking to them about their experiences in refuge, they often say that they get this brilliant practical support, but actually, much as they need that practical support, that holistic support is also really, really important to help with the process of healing, especially in these refuge environments that often have these fabulous peer support networks. Actually having the space and the funding for those more holistic programs is really very important, and something that is a bit of a gap at the moment.
Definitely. And I think there's one more that kind of, and we will take all of these comments away, and they'll sort of help us with feeding into questions for next year and thinking about what our research covers. So it's really, really useful to be hearing from you. I've got somebody agreeing certainly our service is experiencing increased complexity and time spent on cases specifically impact when trying to get through to agencies and creditors, she refers to specifically. But yeah, again, it's that kind of the knock-on effect that we also saw in the cost of living research.
I was just going to add, it was really interesting in some of the interviews when we were talking to some organisations who kind of maybe sort of lost some statutory funding and were trying to have to look at it for other areas, and how much they were starting to think about what kind of areas of work they really wanted to prioritise. And for a lot more of them, it was looking at the kind of holistic services and things like that.
Definitely, it's a really good point. There's a comment here from one of our participants today who says, as a commissioner, agree with the points raised around frustration of short-term funding, things feeling rushed at times. This is often due to how the funding comes to them from central government. So we also want to apply for funding when it becomes available, but again, government parameters on what it can be spent on, often time frames as well to put bids in, and competing against other local authorities. We regularly feedback to Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office that it's not sustainable on all sides. So there's clearly a pattern here with funding and sustainability of funding, being able to plan long term around what we all want, what it, should be at all of the heart of everything we all do, which is survivors' well-being, survivor support, and guiding them through to independence and recovery from trauma. So we're now getting quite a number of questions. So I think rather I'll move us on to a more general Q&A, unless there's any last observations the panel want to make. So I'm going to hop back up to the beginning. So the first question I've got here: how successful have organisations been in expanding the number of bed spaces using domestic abuse funding? Have many been able to gain access to additional physical accommodation to support more people? So I guess that's talking to the number of bed spaces in refuge and how they're funded.
So I'm happy to take that one. So as we covered in the presentation, we have seen an increase in the number of bed spaces from 2021 to 2022. It is important to note that that did come off the back of a significant increase the previous year. So we saw in the previous year at May 2021 the highest ever increase in bed spaces, and we understood that that was largely as a result of emergency funding made available in relation to the pandemic. We anticipated but didn't know whether those bed spaces might go down once that the emergency COVID funding had come to an end. But what we saw was at May 2022 that funding had kind of sustained, and those bed spaces had remained and even further increased. So it seems that the additional statutory duty funding has had an impact there. What is important to note is that obviously a refuge space is about much more than just the physical room. As everybody knows, it's about the support that sits around it. And I think the findings that we've covered really speak to the other pressures on services that impact on their capacity to be able to make that space available. It's important that they need, you know, that resource to have the sufficient staffing to be able to you know, consider the women that they have living in their refuge service and be confident that they've got that additional capacity to provide support to a new resident.
Thank you, Maya. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, which I think we covered in quite a few different parts of our research, and I think is something we've certainly thought about. But the question is, why do you think staff retention has been difficult in recent years?
Should we jump in on that one, Catherine? Do you think? Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, I think a lot of workplaces have been affected by it for kind of the past few years. I think there's kind of lots of reasons, and we didn't really go into it too much. So, you know, some things organizations were telling us, and other things we can kind of only speculate. But I think there was a lot of people leaving work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, you know, it's no different in the domestic abuse sector. And, you know, perhaps people changing and wanting kind of better working conditions and things like that has been a big issue. And then there was services as well who said that you know, they've been losing staff a lot to statutory jobs, you know, that maybe had kind of better pay and better working conditions, so they've been losing a lot of their workforce through that. And another thing I think is just pay, with salaries not rising in this sector a lot of the time, you know, people becoming more concerned obviously about the cost of living, and so you know, they might be looking to jobs with higher pay.
Yeah, definitely. I think the only other thing that I'd probably add on that is what we talked about in terms of greater complexity, greater stress for staff, and I think that relates to burnout that we've already been talking about. And I think in relation to the sort of wage issue, I think this concern around long-term funding and long-term planning for services who are just less able to do that at the moment than they perhaps should be. And I think that's probably one of the frustrating things that they're finding around that inability to kind of forward plan, which relates to staff as well as services.
Yeah, because they're only getting contracts that are very short term. So, you know, of course, you're going to pick a job where the contract is long term.
Definitely. And I think it's important to remember as well that the last few years, whilst there's a lot has happened that's impacted the sector, that's not happened in isolation. And this is all on top of successive cuts over the last decade or decade and a half. And, you know, we've seen salaries before COVID came along, we were already seeing salaries in the sector drop quite drastically in some cases. So there's very much a cumulative impact that's sort of reaching ahead now. Thank you. I've got a question that is a point of clarification for somebody. So what did the point around commercial opportunities and universal housing refer to? Is somebody able to just expand on that a little? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm able to kind of jump back into that. So that was one of the things that came out from the survey and from the interviews around the commissioning processes that services have found over the past year, in how that they're sort of being invited to participate in that tendering process, the kind of applications that they're needing to put in. I think it's just concerns around whether, because of the sort of rush nature of this, which I think that, you know, we've had comments around that happens at every level. That's not just happening at local authority level. That's various different reasons for that. There tends to be perhaps more of a kind of emphasis on what has the lowest administrative burden, what's the easiest to sort of implement, rather than prioritizing that sort of specialism that domestic abuse services can offer. If that sort of answers the question.
I hope so. Yes, thank you very much. So moving through, we've got a few more questions. Hopefully I'm going to be able to get through them all. If we can't get to anything, then we will follow up after the event. with responses. Please could you say more about your experience or the experience of our members and other service providers around how local authorities are assessing needs for women outside their area. So I think this question is around the duty and how needs assessments for women who don't already live in that relevant local authority are being addressed. Was there anything that came up through this research around that?
I'm not sure I'm able to directly answer that at the moment. I can definitely look more into that and get back to you, but I think that it possibly reflects a concern that came up quite a lot around how needs assessments possibly would be more helpful to have more regional emphasis and more look towards actually not just looking within a specific local authority area, but looking at regional needs assessments and how that can be applied across larger areas.
Yeah, I think this question taps into sort of not necessarily things that we're looking at within the annual audit, but things that we're doing wider as a research and evaluation team within Women's Aid. So we're working with the Department of Levelling Up Housings and Communities on updating that needs assessment for local authorities and looking at the kind of data we have and how we can map that. And also working with our policy team to look at the different kind of local authority areas. And I think, Sarah, you can perhaps speak on this a tiny bit, just in terms of the other research you've been doing about how we have observed that there isn't often that kind of dedicated funding for people coming from different local authorities and the understanding of how that's mapped. So that is something that we've kind of picked up on as a team that we are aware of. And I think the person who's asked us has kind of tapped on an issue that we're aware of and we're looking into at the moment, but don't necessarily have a good answer to right now.
Yeah, and I think it's very much observing how it continues to play out, particularly, you know, with talking to our membership on a regular basis and hearing feedback, but it's certainly something that's at risk. Okay, I will move on to the next question. Okay, so there's a point here, sorry, which I missed earlier, which I think was very much a sort of an observation around change. And the observation is that, you know, is there anything that can be done about the commercialised tendering process? Are there conversations with commissioners on these issues and the risks to survivors? And I would say that's certainly something, you know, rather than necessarily in our research where we pull out the evidence around issues that come up and the impact that they have for other teams within Women's Aid, I know is a priority to look not just at the funding offer that comes from central government, but how that is implemented on a local basis, distributed, and, you know, ensuring it's a huge part of that puzzle, not just the money, but how it's distributed, where it's distributed, and of course oversight to ensure that it is going to the right places and having the right impact. So yeah, that's a really good observation. Thank you very much, because of course the risk to survivors of the wrong services is obviously massive, and it's a very much a core part of our using our evidence base going forward to inform other work across the organisation. Okay, I think I've got a question here which I'm not sure that we're going to be able to answer today, but I would, just in case anybody has anything. I wondered if there were any figures broken down into age for those victim survivors who have been offered support with applying for an occupational order. Thinking about the complexity for some older women who might have access needs, and clearly refuge services limited for that group, wonder what part ageist assumptions played in offering long-term housing options with this group of women, and whether the same options are offered to older women. Some of their own research suggests that's not the case. Yeah, and I think we're aware of it comes back to that point about stereotypes and that, you know, domestic abuse happens to anybody. I think we can possibly talk a little bit about how older women are seen in the data in the report, but I would certainly agree that there is a gap provision and in how older women are supported, which we see in the lack of women in sort of 60+ age groups coming into services when we know that they're experiencing high levels of domestic abuse. Does anybody want to jump in with any observations from the report? I've just had a really poorly timed, but everybody has frozen, so I can't see if somebody's jumping in.
Okay, I think you're back.
I am sorry, I couldn't see
You're
if
back.
anybody was
Yeah.
about to talk.
I think you're back. No, I don't have anything to add, but that's I think that's a really interesting point. And I mean, it, you know, obviously it kind of, yeah, relates a lot about sort of barriers to accessing refuge and things like that. But I don't think there was anything in the report about that we looked at, but it is interesting.
Yeah. I would just add that in terms of our data, as I kind of noted in my presentation, that we do kind of have a bit of a gap when it comes to older women. So when we start dividing down by different accommodation types, the kind of analysis and conclusions we can draw can be quite limited, but it's definitely an interesting kind of provocation to start thinking about different accommodation types, and definitely something we could look at taking forward in further research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting point and sort of observation on how the insight that we're getting from our data might actually have, you know, the way that can play out in somebody's life, and that can really inform what we do going forward. So it's really useful to have. Okay, the next question that I have is, how does the resource issue, funding, staffing, you know, so all of that, impact on ability to effectively risk assess? I think that we sort of touched on this in a number of the presentations, and George, you've sort of talked about it in responses about that, having to prioritise time, I think, really, and overstretched staff. There will always be an impact, and you have to prioritise immediate things that come up, and that kind of wider, longer term observation can suffer. Catherine, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I was just going to very much agree, and I think the thing that I would just add is just around, it really came through in the survey and the interviews around actually what is the implication of all of this for survivors. I think that's absolutely the center of every single service's thoughts, is how does that survivor journey get impacted, and what are we more likely to miss? How can we support them in different ways? And yeah, so how does it impact the survivor's journey? So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I was just going to add, sorry, a quote that we had in the survey here, which just says, increase in demand for services for refuge, lack of move-on accommodation after refuge, resulting in bed blocking, no support for domestic abuse survivors within the community who are not medium to high risk as deemed by the DASH risk assessment. And I'm sure, yeah, many of you know that, you know, there are limitations to the DASH risk assessment.
And I believe we've touched on it in some of our research about how early intervention often has, you know, before the risk level escalates, will often have better outcomes both for the survivor and for statutory services and funding in the local authorities. So it's definitely something that is worth thinking about.
Hello, sorry, I had another moment.
You're back, Sarah.
Is she back?
I'm so sorry, everybody. Luckily, we seem to have been generous enough with time to allow for me nipping in and out. I'm not doing it on purpose. Okay. Yeah, an observation here, for many managers in the statutory sector, they're also facing very significant resource restrictions. They need staff that can look in many directions, which I think links back to what we've talked about. The push to bring posts in-house is influenced on their part by a wish to control and respond flexibly with the workforce you have, as well as a lack of understanding about the benefits of specialist provision. I think that is a really, really important point and a really key part of the role that we have to play at Women's Aid in terms of raising awareness about why it's so important to have specialist services outside of the statutory sector, or independent of those major bodies, and the value of the work that they do. And I know we've got ongoing research at the moment looking at that in more detail. Does anybody want to come in with, sorry, I might be going again, anything else around that kind of move to bringing services in-house? It's okay.
I think just to say that it's something that Women's Aid are going to be looking at, I think, a lot more. And this is one of the wonderful things I think about the annual audit, is that as different things come up and change, we're able to kind of respond to that. So it's something that's going to be looked at over the next year.
Definitely a key priority for us. And then the last question that I have, which is a really positive one to end on, how can local groups help lobby for more sustainable funding? What can we do going forward? And that is certainly something I'm going to come back to you on outside of this meeting, because we don't have anybody on the panel today from our policy team, and this is very much their area of work, and one of their priority areas of focus is thinking about sustainability of funding and how we can work with local groups. We all, we're stronger together with one voice and providing resources for you. So watch this space, and I will before we go back out with we'll send you a summary of responses in the follow-up to this session, and hopefully have a little bit more information there. So yes, there's definitely a role for all of us in raising awareness. I think making the case for the value of what we do, using relationships that you have with your commissioners already, the information they have, and obviously I'm going to turn that back around to tools like OnTrack, which help you to record the outcomes and the value of everything that you do, and really do tap into that network of workshops that George talked about in her presentation earlier, talking about how to use your data for maximum impact, service return on investment, and all of those kind of things. So there's a lot more on our website, in terms of tightening up the way that you talk about the value of what you do. We all know it's a case of making sure that that message is landing where it needs to, and having a consistent message across all of us.
It's probably worth me highlighting as well that much as we'd love everyone using OnTrack, the workshops are available to people who are not using OnTrack. So
yes,
if you don't want to take up the case management system, but you do want to take part in any of the workshops, then that's fine.
Definitely. And do we have a slide with our contact details, just to sort of throw up?
I believe the slide at the end of the presentation had some contact details on it.
I see Catherine nodding and looking at her computer, so I think it's winging its way to us. So you can find out more about OnTrack and that workshop program as well. I've talked about our evidence hub, which you can see the link to there. This report, all of our other reports are there. The data dashboards with that kind of live data that are referenced. Hopefully you heard me reference in the introduction around some of the data that's released every year can be found there, and also more information about the work we do and the data sets that we have, and how to get in touch around OnTrack is included in that. There's an email address there for any further questions that you might have. Before we let you go, however, I'm just double checking no more questions have come through. Before we let you go, we will be sending around a feedback form afterwards. This style of event is relatively new to us, so we really want to build on how your feedback in terms of making them useful, and bridging that sort of making a bridge between the data and the evidence that we're putting out there, and making sure that it's used to inform policy and practice across all of the sectors that it's relevant to. But before we let you go, we're going to ask you to answer one question from us in the, it's going to magically appear in a poll form somehow. Luckily, it's not me doing it. Yay. So if you don't mind just answering this question, do you think you're likely to use information from the webinar in your work or discussions going forward? That would really help us. Yeah, nobody can see your response. And then, as I say, we will send out a feedback form and just a quick summary of responses to those questions that we've read out today. And thank you to everybody who's responded to our call out. Thank you, anonymous attendee who found this webinar really valuable. That's great to hear. And the slides, yes, we can share the slides alongside that as well. But yeah, and as I was saying, thank you to everybody who shared those kind of observations about whether your experiences are reflected in the work that we do, that we put together, because we're sort of always looking to make sure that it's keeping up with what's relevant and what's useful. Okay, I think the poll has disappeared now, which I think only leaves me to say thank you very, very much for coming today and listening to us. It's been slightly odd not being able to have any noise back from you, but we're getting used to this this style of presentation now. Thank you very much, and I will let you all go.
Right.